Hi again. After I did the video about the memories of Steve Cattle, I was contacted by Anthony, a good friend who's a karate instructor, and he suggested that I do a video about my experience training in Japan. And this was something I'd had in the back of my mind for quite a while. But then thinking about it, and I started making notes and realized I had quite a bit of material. And I started scanning photographs as well. And so I've put it together, and this is the first episode in what's going to be at least 4 videos. And I'll release them once every few weeks. I'll cover the training, navigating Tokyo, the lifestyle, what it was like living over there, interacting with Japanese people, language difficulties and so on, the food, the characters I met, some very, very famous, and competitions, training events, trips, and so on. Now, I didn't keep a diary in Japan. I kept a couple of notebooks which were really a record of the training, how kata was performed, how different techniques were performed. I did drawings, which I'm no artist, and it made the cave paintings look like Michelangelo. But you know, there were no I didn't have recorders or anything like that back then, so that was all I had. So this is all from memory. It all started really when Terry O'Neill was on the British team at the first World All Styles Open Karate Championships in Tokyo. This was the WUKO event, World Union of Karate Organizations. And we were working together at the time. Well, actually, I filled in for him at the Victoriana Club while he was in Japan. And then I stayed on working with him when he came home. But while he was there, he sent me a couple of postcards, and he mentioned that he'd met an Okinawan Goju master called Master Higaonna, and how impressed he was with him. And I was interested in Okinawan karate and particularly Goju at the time. So it piqued my interest. And when he came home, I really got into him about his experiences in Japan. And the main things that emerged was his impression of Goju training at Yoyogi, and also the other dojo at Ikebukuro, I think, and how impressed he was with Higaonna Sensei, but also with Ken Ogawa, who was one of the students. As Terry said, many masters are brilliant, but if the students impress you as well, there's something to this training. He was also impressed with Muay Thai, which you saw over there, and he also mentioned Gary, who we'd met. A short time after this, a film was shown by a martial arts distributor of the championship, and it included the demonstration that Higaonna Sensei gave at the WUKO event, and it was defense against multiple attackers. And this is quite a well-known demonstration event. Most of the major instructors do it, but Higaonna Sensei did it in a different way. He just stood in the middle and they attacked him as a mass, all together, doing whatever they wanted. and he was just in the middle, moving his what's called taisabaki, body evasion, blocking, countering, and it was spontaneous, and it was amazing. So fast forward 2 years to the next WUKO event, which was in Paris, and I travelled over with the squad. I was a member of the BKCC council at the time, and I went over there, and there I met Higuan Sensei for the first time, and he came back to Liverpool with two South African instructors, Hugh St. John Thompson and his brother Dennis, and they all stayed at Terry's, and they were en route back to South Africa, where Higuan Sensei was going to be there for several months. And Terry had actually met Hugh in '68 when he was on a team touring South Africa, and then he met him again in 1970. He was at Yoyogi. So I had many interesting conversations, and Higuan Sensei actually came and taught us. I had a small group at the time, only a handful of guys, and it was such an honor to have this world famous instructor. Not only taught us, but he did a demonstration. He performed Seizan kata and also the sai kata, the long sai kata, and it was amazing. And that really made up my mind. And then about a month later, I remember very clearly, I woke up in bed, and I'd always had in my mind the notion that I want to go to Japan. And I woke up and I said, I am going to go to Japan. I changed. I didn't realize at the time, but this is an NLP technique. From wannabe to gonna be. So 6 months later, I was in Japan. I booked my flight with what was then called a bucket shop. The Sunday papers were full of adverts for travel, and companies would offer tickets to all the major long haul destinations at reduced prices. And just at random, I phoned one up and I booked, and I went via Pakistan International Airlines. Went down to Heathrow. This was on Friday the 13th of April, a couple of days after my birthday. Great day to travel, Friday the 13th. The flight went via Rome, Cairo, Karachi, and then Tokyo. There were a group of Chinese government people on the flight, and they all dressed the same in the Chairman Mao uniforms, and they got off at Karachi and caught a flight to Peking, and unfortunately my suitcase went with them, so when I arrived in Tokyo, I didn't have my main suitcase, but they did deliver it a couple of days later. I took a taxi. I'd phoned Arthur Tansley. Now, Arthur had been resident in Japan for several years. He was originally from the Midlands, and he'd been travelling Australia and so on, served in the military police, and he was a fourth dan in judo at the Kodokan. And he had agreed to be our official photographer in Japan, and he was a professional photographer. He also supported himself by doing movie work, taking on the roles of the mad foreigner, or in adverts and so on. So I phoned him, he gave me his address, and I took a taxi, and he put me up for a couple of days, first couple of days in Japan. He was living with a Japanese woman who was a doctor, Dr. Tomikawa, and she was very nice and very hospitable. Anyway, the next morning was a Sunday, and Arthur took me to Yoyogi, to the dojo, and we took a bus. And on the bus were a group of Japanese schoolgirls, and they were giggling at Arthur and pointing at him and saying, Mr. Ebifry. Arthur was in an advert where he dressed up as a chef, and it was a bit like seeing Colonel Sanders. Ebifry was a prawn instant meal, and so he was quite a well-known character. We went to Yoyogi. Higwon Sensei arrived. Dojo wasn't actually open, but he very kindly came down and had a chat to him, and he took me, Arthur left, and Sensei took me to McDonald's, and it was the first McDonald's I'd ever had. They weren't in the UK at the time, and they didn't come over to here for several years because hamburgers had such a bad reputation. Company called Empire Catering, which owned Wimpy, had these dreadful hamburgers which were just full of grease and horrible. And McDonald's, by comparison, at the time seemed very, very nice. The Big Mac had the mayo in and the salad and so on, and the milkshakes. Which, although they were listed on the menu as milkshake, you had to say milku shaku, or they didn't understand you. And it became, the McDonald's was a centre for us because we could get condiments there, salt, pepper, mustard, and so on, and take them back to the apartment. Anyway, after leaving Sensei, I decided to do some sightseeing, and the only place I really had heard of was the Ginza. And I got a subway to the Ginza. Now, first problem with transport in Japan, I think I've mentioned this before, is that on the London Underground, where you have two lines like the Northern and the Victoria or the Piccadilly and so on, where they intersect, it's a hub. So you go from one line up an escalator or down an escalator to the other line, they interconnect. And I thought that's how it worked in Japan. It doesn't. Even though on the map, the two lines will have a station with the same name, you have to actually come out of the station, cross the road, find the other line station and go into it. And it took me a while to realise this. So I went down to the Ginza. It was a Sunday, but in Japan, they have a system which I think is brilliant, and it could do it being adopted here, where all the major department stores are open for 6 days and they close for 1 day, but they all close for a different day. So on a Sunday, you have, a sixth of the stores are open. So it's really good. And I went into one of the big ones, and there's a girl in a kimono bowing to Rasamese as you come in and so on, or they grab you and try and polish your nails and do all sorts of things. And I was wandering around looking at all the consumer goods, and there was a sports gear section. So I thought, I wonder if they sell nunchaku. And I went in, and I was amazed to find that in Japan, in one of the biggest, most renowned department stores, you couldn't buy nunchaku, but you could buy baseball gloves. So that was rather a cultural shock for me. So I got a bit hungry, and I noticed a machine. Now, in Japan at the time, you could get many things from slot machines in the street, including beer. You could have cans of beer in the street. I always remarked to Brits, even at that time, 1973 in England, how long a beer dispensing machine would stay on the wall in Liverpool before it was levered off and just robbed. At one time you could get, chocolate and stuff like that from slot machines in stations. They all had gone by then because of vandalism. But in Japan it was quite the thing. Crime and vandalism, it was almost unknown. So there was a picture of a steaming pot of what turned out to be noodles. So I thought, oh, this is good. Put my money in, and the pot came, but it just had a pack of dried noodles with a foil wrapper of flavour with it. You had to add the hot water yourself, so that was lesson number one. I did eat these instant pot noodles. Again, they were unknown in the UK at the time because they were so cheap in Japan, but I've never eaten them since. The next day, I made a beeline for the Tokaido shop. Tokaido was the premier supplier of martial arts equipment, and I'd found out where the nearest subway was, and I got to there. And then you then encounter the major problem of navigating in Japan, which is all the signs are in kanji, in characters. Uh, the second problem is most of the streets, the majority of streets, don't have names. Ginza is about the only one of very few streets that had a name. There's another big um, major peripheral highway called Kananadori, which had a name, but most of the streets didn't. And the Japanese address system is based on a geographical shape called a cho, and and they're all different shapes. And then in a street, the houses are numbered according to which was built first, so they're not consecutive like here. And as I say, it's in kanji anyway. So big problems, but they have a really good system where they have police boxes all over the place. They're called koban. Now, just a little kind of pillbox with a phone, somewhere to sit for the officer, brew kit, and so on. And every neighbourhood has its local police officer, and he knows the area. So I went up, I sort of memorised a few phrases, and I asked him where I could buy a gi. And he sort of said, Chotto Mate, picked up the phone, and this is another great thing, and got through to an English speaking officer. So he passes the phone to me and he said, yes, what is it you want? So I said, I want to go to the shop which sells karate gi. And he said, what is that? So I said, you understand karate? And eventually he did. I think I said, judo. Ah, karate, yeah. I said, the clothing for training. He said, you mean like a uniform? I said, yes. He said, you mean like a gi? Ah, gi. Ah. Passed me the phone to the officer, and a bit of backwards and forwards, and the guy pointed me and in the direction, and I ended up in the Tokaido shop. Very small shop, but I ordered a gi. And they had books, and one in particular was by Master Inoue, who was one of the most revered instructors in Ryukyu Kobudo, which is Okinawan weapons. And the book had all the kata of all the different weapons, including very arcane ones like the shield and tsurichin and things like this. And it was in Japanese, but I thought, oh, I must have this. It wasn't very Japanese books weren't expensive. English language books tended to be. So I bought this, ordered my gi, and off I went to yogi for my first class. Excuse me. I had a little bit of time, so near the station was a coffee shop, and I went in, and it was quite full, and there was one place, one seat, and I sat down, and I was at a table with a young Japanese couple. I had my coffee and I opened my book, and the chap, seeing that it was a book about the martial arts, engaged me in conversation. And the amazing thing was he was an Aikido practitioner who had studied, he'd been at teacher training college in Chester, not too far from Liverpool, and he'd actually done Aikido in the same sports centre that I was teaching in back in Liverpool, the Vernon Sangster. They had an Aikido group as well, which was run by Terry Ezra, a very famous Aikido chap now. This is amazing, the most popular city in the world at the time, and I sit down next to somebody who'd been into the same dojo in Liverpool that I was. And he asked where I was training, and sometime later he phoned up Yogi and spoke to Higawana Sensei and invited me for a meal and took me out for dinner. It was very nice. And I found that, generally speaking, the Japanese were very hospitable and very friendly. They would engage you in conversation to practice their English. The only downside was they were over helpful to the point where if you asked them directions and they didn't know, they didn't want to disappoint you, so they'd tell you just any old direction. Or, yeah, that is the train to get, it being the opposite direction. But they weren't doing it to deliberately wind you up. So I go to the dojo and I do the first session, which was being conducted by what was called the deshi, the uchi deshi, which means the trainee instructor or assistant. It means an inner student, whose name was Kokobo-san. And so I did that class. Now, I've got to say that I wasn't really physically as fit as I could have been. I was reasonably fit, but I wasn't in any really serious training condition. But I knew from some of the training I'd done in the past that I would pass out rather than give in. I did know how to push myself. So did the first class and it was reasonably energetic, but I wanted to wait and again speak to Higawana Sensei and also to take his class. And after a short interval, he turned up and there was the second class, and I stayed and I did that. I wasn't intending to, but I thought it was just good manners, so I did 2 classes back to back on my first day. And I thought, well, that hasn't killed me. And that became what I did then. I trained twice a day. Later on, when Terry came over, that got interrupted a bit, but that was my main thing all the time I was in Japan, was to get as many sessions in. I mean, that was my aim, was to train. I met the other main Gaijin or foreigner at the time training there, who's a black belt. His name was Pat Telsrow, and he was a student of Ken Ogawa, who I mentioned before, who was teaching in Orlando, Florida. Now, Ken Ogawa was a bit of a legend, and he was a physical, absolute physical dynamo from all accounts. I never met him, but from everyone who spoke to him, from Terry, who was not easily impressed, to people like Pat, he really was an inspiration. So Pat was a former US Marine. He'd done his conscription and been to Vietnam and so on. I got into him about unarmed combat training in the Marines and so on, and he said they didn't really do any. He said the Vietnamese are small guys, he said, and we didn't really need to know much to be able to defeat them in empty hand stuff. And it was mainly done with infantry weapons and air power. So that was it. He was a very solid guy, Pat. Very nice guy, giving me a lot of good advice um, uh, while I was there in Japan, and he was very heavily into his training, very committed. So that was our training all week. The following Sunday, there was a competition in the Shibuya Area Association, which Higuan Sensei was a member of, and he was more or less obliged to put a team in, and I got roped in to enter. It was the last thing I wanted to do. I wasn't in Japan to take part in competitions, um, but ended up having to. I competed, only been there a week, so really wasn't a good representative. But I managed to get through to the next event, which was going to be in a few weeks. So, but the sort of highlight of the Shibuya event was meeting Gima Sensei. Now, he was an Okinawan who what had been the original pupil of Gichin Funakoshi Sensei, who was obviously the chief importer of karate into Japan from Okinawa, and you know, the Shotokan style came from him. And Gima Sensei was a very revered, very knowledgeable um, master who turned up at Yogi quite often. So I did get to see him quite a bit, and he kind of ran the Shibuya organization. Then the following Sunday was the official opening of the international college that Yamaguchi Sensei of Goju Kai had set up. He'd got financing for this big live-in um, university of martial arts. It wasn't just going to be Goju Kai, they would do weapons and all sorts of things. And Higuan Sensei was invited, and he brought Pat and I along with him. And we sat there and watched uh, quite a few speeches. Um, Yamaguchi Sensei, the famous The Cat, whose book I'd read, and really was the figurehead of Goju in most of the world. And he was talking in Japanese, obviously, about his uh, background history, training with Master Miyagi and so on. And I could kind of feel Higuana Sensei tense a little bit because, to be quite honest, and I don't want to get political or anything like that, um, Master Miyagi never graded anybody in Japan, and he never stayed for longer than a couple of weeks or a month or so at a time. So, a very tenuous connection. Having said that, Goju Kai is a very, very good style. It's one that, to my mind, one of the most practical systems, and especially as taught by Gary. He kind of took the essence of Goju Kai and he turned it into his own form, which was very, very good for street self-defense or personal self-defense. One of the masters who gave a demonstration was the author of the book I'd bought on the Okinawan weapons, Master Inoue, and he did bow kata, as I recall. Training at Yogi, I'm going to go into it in some detail in a future episode, but this is getting a bit long, so I'll just mention a couple of things. I was used to some bad flaws of dojos. I used to train at a place that had a black stone floor, and we used to train there barefoot in the winter, and the only showers were cold, and we loved it. Um, but that was luxury in the old Monty Python sketch compared to Yogi. Yogi was uneven. It had nails sticking up at times, and after my first week or so, a lot of the skin on the soles of my feet was missing. Similarly, the skin on my knuckles was missing from doing makiwara, to the point where I found it hard to put my hands in my pockets. It would hurt. And I asked Sensei, and he told me to go to the pharmacy, and he wrote what to buy. And it turned out it was this red liquid that I rubbed on all the open areas, and it turned out to be mercurochrome, which is a strong disinfectant. Now, I had read that the fish in Japan had been contaminated with mercury, so I was ingesting mercury through the food and also through these open cuts, which is a toxic metal. And I always joke that in the summer, you know, the mercury made my spine 6 inches longer. One of the characters I met at the time was an American chap called Frank Hargrove. He turned up at the dojo and used to drop in quite frequently. He was a very high grade in Okinawan karate and also in Kobudo, in the weapons. Trained in Okinawa, spoke Japanese fluently, and was a very friendly guy. Gave me a lot of good advice, and he had this stunning Japanese girlfriend who was tall for a Japanese, and he asked her how long I was staying and so on, and he said, you've got to get your alien registration card. It's by law over there. And his girlfriend agreed to take me there, and we met up, and she took me to the local government office where you had to do this, and steered me through. It would have been a nightmare. You can imagine applying for any kind of license here if you didn't speak the language. So she was very, really helpful, and I got my alien registration, the 41163, which allowed me to live in Japan. You had to carry it with you at all times. But Frank turned up a lot, and later on Terry met him, and Terry became very friendly with him as well, and he was a great guy. I used to drop in a little bar. You're always thirsty in Japan. I used to suffer from thirst, and I was always wanting to drink fluids, and one of the few things that actually cures a thirst is beer. So I'd drop in for a beer, and there was this local little bar near where I lived. They were called Nika bars, and just a middle-aged woman behind the bar, and about 6, maybe a couple more seats. And it was very friendly, just like your local pub would be here. But I'd read this thing in a guide to Japan, a warning to beware of being fleeced in rip-off sort of hostess bars, which were mainly in places like Shinjuku, where the beer would be a set price. You could see how much the beer was, but then anything else, if you ate the peanuts, they'd be, you know, a couple of thousand yen. And if the hostess poured you beer, that would cost so much, and the conversation would cost so much. And you'd come out owing thousands, and some unwary tourists not realising with the rate of exchange what the bill they were being presented was. So I was wary of this, and in this bar the first time I went in, and they offered me some snacks. They had this dried squid called ika and peanuts and stuff, and I was going, no, until I realised that it wasn't one of those places. But I only mention it because it was a great way to learn Japanese, because they really didn't speak English, they were just locals, and also to learn about Japan, the customs and so on. For example, in a bar, you pour the person next to you beer, and they pour your beer into your glass. You don't buy rounds or any of that nonsense, but you pour beer keep his glass topped up. It's just one of the things. I found that useful when I went to some of the dojo parties. Another place I visited was the JKA Honbu at Yotsuya. Got off the train and again, where's the dojo? It's all in Japanese. But lo and behold, there's a guy in a gi crossing the road. So I went over to him and bowed and in Japanese said, where's the dojo? And he sort of went, ugh, pointed, and there it was. I could see the Rising Sun badge. And I went in, and the gent behind the desk was the famous Takagi, who was the secretary of the JK, an instructor in his own right from the past. And I asked if it was okay to watch a session, and he asked where I trained. And when I said Yogi, he made me most welcome. And the reason being was that our senior, Mr. Ito, had defeated the JK champion in an open competition, so won the respect. I later went back with Terry and the team, and I'll talk about that later. But it was a place I always wanted to visit, and I had a memorable time there. They were very, very. It was an impressive place to visit, full of memories. I'd read Moving Zen, and it sort of influenced me. Another place I went to was the Budokan, the big martial arts training hall, and I went there because there was a judo championship, and Terry wanted the results of it, and I'd arranged with Arthur, he was going to be there to take photos, and I went along, and getting off the subway, I think it was Ichigaya, it was full of judo guys, and they all looked apart. Most of the karate guys don't look like anything, but the judo guys did, broken noses, cauliflower ears, they really looked tough. Competition, I watched it, didn't really understand it. The scoring system was alien to me. The judo I'd done as a schoolboy was different. But I took the results, and it was interesting. It was first of many visits I made to that place, and I'll talk about more about that really illustrious place. So after a few weeks, Terry arrived because the JKA World Championships was going to be held, and Terry was the captain of the team, but he came out in advance to spend some time in Japan. I met him at the airport. We got the monorail to Hamamatsucho, and then local train, subway into where I was staying in Meguro. And he was staying I'd got an apartment by then, small apartment. He was staying there. And I remember he dumped his kit, and I said, we'll go out and get a coffee. And I remember standing on the main street. It was it was April, warm evening, and I looked at him. I said, well, we made it. Here we are in Japan. It's something we talked about doing. And he said, well, what have you been doing since you've been here? And I said, well, I've been training. And so that's the main thing I've done. Mentioned the Yamaguchi University. I said, well, mainly training. And he said, okay, but there's quite a few things we need to do. Interviews for Fighting Arts magazine, primarily with Don Drager. He was the guy we both wanted to meet, and also to go to Okinawa. Particularly for me, that was a massive ambition. I wanted to go to Okinawa, so that was the aim, and that's what I'll talk about in the next installment.